Right, I'm going to be talking about applying universal design for learning to assessments to enable neurodiverse learners. In general, this panel addresses curricula and materials with an eye to common difficulties associated with neurodiversity. Some frequent characteristics are difficulty with establishing and maintaining focus, daily tasks, difficulty with attention to detail, challenges with organizations, difficulty with executive functioning, which is the ability to effectively plan and complete tasks. Uh, these are characteristics specifically of ADHD, which an increasing number of our students have in recent years. But these characteristics are also common among many students who have not been diagnosed or who haven't set up accommodations. When students come to college, they lose many of the support structures they had in high school, and they typically have to be more proactive in setting up accommodations themselves. But this involves organizational skills, executive functioning skills that are specifically their deficits. So not all students who need accommodations come to us with accommodations set up. So with this in mind, let me see, make sure I can see my slides despite the computer stuff. These are challenges that many students face, whether or not they have disabilities too. Not only do not all have accommodation set up, but many students face these, especially in the process of growing up. So the idea then is to proactively address characteristics that many students have, whether or not they've been diagnosed and whether or not they've set up accommodations, shifting the focus from a larger logistical accommodations for specific learners, extra time. We're often told things like extra time, a quiet place for testing, which they may still need and we provide. But we also, I think, can consider the underlying characteristics, the underlying deficits in a more universal way. They apply to more people, and they have to do with more than test taking or the specifics of our course. So the core focus of this presentation is universal design and learning and assessment. How can the core principles of universal design and learning help us optimize our assessment procedures for students with disabilities, but also for students in general, supporting their growth as students in general? The framing idea of UDL is to plan curricula, class activities, homework, etc., in a way that inherently accommodates a wide range of student learning styles, motivations, goals, starting points, capacity levels, time constraints, and the many, many other types of diversity that we have in our classrooms. What helps a target group may, in fact, be helpful for others too. So we examine our assessment frameworks and attempt to find solutions that address the reasons behind typical accommodations. What do diverse students need as learners, not only as test takers, and also what can potentially benefit all of our students? So here's some overview of guidelines of universal design. Each category has a list of multiple guidelines, which are framing ideas, several checkpoints, specific things to consider as we plan our curricula, providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression. And here's the link, and I'd be glad to email it to anyone who would like it. It's quite an extensive site. I'm just going to point out a few things rather than going over it thoroughly, just give you a little bit of a roadmap and some ideas about how I use these general ideas to guide my attempts to figure out how to be more accommodating. So engagement has to do with the why of learning. And as you can see, there are many different checkpoints, many different components to this. Their representation has to do with the what of learning, what are students learning, and again, has many different components for us to think about breaking down these, just as we try to do for our students, breaking down these broad categories. And action and expression has to do with the how of learning. So there are many, many aspects of this, and I'm going to break it down a little bit within the overarching topic of assessment. So these guidelines are downloadable in many languages, not quite yet any Slavic languages, but give them some time. not only their content, but their format offers some models of visual and other scaffolding that are very helpful for neurodiverse students. Consistent format applied, distinguishing colors, vivid pictures, simple framing, questions, multiple types of input as they encourage within their specific guidelines to engage people with varying perceptual strengths and preferences. So, considering the idea of engagement, how do we create lessons and assessments that provide options that can help all learners regulate their own learning, sustain effort and motivation, and engage and interest all learners? And specifically, how can we assess in ways that contribute to engagements? Self-regulation, for example, through formative assessments, which are intended to be informative, not punitive. For example, students making corrections, giving them a choice of reflecting on or explaining their mistakes or writing variants. So targeted, motivated by wanting to get a better grade, among other things. A focus, helping students helping students practice that focus and help them develop analytical skills and their capacity to use models independently. Because after all, we want them to spend their whole lives learning foreign languages, and we want to show them how to be independent learners of languages. Issues of focus can lead to issues of input for students with ADHD. Input, in fact, can be accessible if it is not engaging. It's not necessarily that they don't want to do something that they don't like. It's that it may not be noticed. Cognitively, it may not be noticed, and therefore it will pass by unprocessed, and then which makes the input meaningless for them. So we can optimize individual choice and autonomy to make sure that it is engaging. Vocabulary learning through projects and general project-based learning is particularly helpful. Students can generate their own lists and Quizlets. I've been doing a lot of experimentation with AI, having students create example sentences. Of course, I have to correct them. I have to go over with them. I show them how to use AI. I teach them how to be what I call AI skeptics. But nevertheless, AI can go a long way to help us individuate for all students. Another thing that students like is giving them a topical list. I had a test like this today, a quiz like this today. Students select the vocabulary they consider the most important, and then I don't write a separate quiz for everybody as I would for the one I mentioned before with AI. But I take the top picks. I tell them what the top picks are, and so they're engaged. They're involved in choosing their vocabulary list. Tapping visitors for motivated use of target forms. For example, this was an assessment I had with a graduate student who's about to go to a job interview and had to teach a third-year course. So I told them use 6 different verbs. I want them to choose the ones that are meaningful to them. And their grade for the quiz is based on their interaction. The students are motivated by interactions, by communication. So how they use those questions was the basis for their quiz. Also, another thing that at least I find challenging is getting students to check input and incorporate input and ask for it, so to speak, input. And this is a good way to get motivated checking of input. I think in general, another aspect of sustaining effort and persistence is highlighting the salience of goals and objectives. Thinking about what are our long-term goals in our curriculums, where do they overlap most with our students' goals? And that's something that is changing, of course, always changing. We may need to pause and consider what we test, when we test, and how. Maybe we don't need to test all those verbs of motion all at once. Maybe we can do it more gradually and in more creative ways that may be more memorable. What is functional for students relative to their goals and their interests now, and how is that changing over time? Focus on core communicative context that students find engaging. Not everything has to be tested immediately if it's conceptually difficult. Students might need more time or a more creative modality for the assessment where they can practice using the forms so that the assessment gives them practice too, but they're not responsible for form-based learning, for example. An example of this was aspect in the future. Aspect in the future is quite difficult, morphologically difficult and conceptually difficult, since there isn't the one-to-one correspondence that they expect from English. So have them do a promotional recording. If you come, если вы поступите в наш университет, вы будете жить в общежитии, as opposed to вы получите качественное образование. So contrasting aspect through a particular context of a promotional recording. It's a memorable context, meaningful, and certainly more meaningful than getting a bad grade on a written test. For neurodiverse students, issues with executive function can lead to challenges in organization and meeting long-term goals. So it's important for them and for all students in general to articulate our goals clearly from the start. That's part of our marketing. Break long-term goals into actionable steps, both for our classes and as a meta school. In the humanities, we're preparing students for life, and this is a meta skill that we can help students develop. And assess specific components of the goals and articulate students' progress. Show their trajectory over the projected year on the ADFL scale. The ADFL scale is very powerful. The specific discourse of types and functions. Use this vocabulary when identifying task types to remind them that they are moving towards achieving their goals. Revisit the specific functions and discourse types periodically. So this is something I do with my, this is my third year students, but actually I would do it at lower levels too. What specifically are they doing at which levels, and how does that map with our particular courses? And then at the third year level, here are some particular goals, and this is the language that we'll be using throughout the year. And when I give them feedback on assessments, I can suggest certain aspects of these language goals. Those are only language goals, it's not all of our goals. So continuing on this idea, prioritizing and highlighting these functions. For example, I do individuated OPIs, which I've talked about in another ACDR context, so I won't talk about much now. But this is another time where I can use AI. It's quite difficult to write down every student says and then give them that. But if we can write down what they say in shorthand, just kno for kniga, and then AI can generate the full words for us so the students can see how much they're able to say. So instead of a frightening oral assessment, it's a celebration of how much that they're able to say, and AI can help us with that. You can add stress marks, so motivating them to use the feedback. They could, if we had stress marks, so they can practice orally for the next oral assessment, and then next steps based on the ADFL benchmarks. Use more cohesive devices, use more precise vocabulary, try to avoid хорошее and use more precise vocabulary relative to the goals that they're moving towards. Breaking long-term goals into actionable steps, showing them how to do that. I typically do weekly item-based low-stakes quizzes on the core points that they vocabulary or grammar, so they gradually accumulate their building blocks, and with they have a chance to reinforce this. If they don't get it 1 week, they can get it by the end of the next week before the test. And then the test repeats some elements, but they focus more on extended communication. And for me personally, I prefer to have more flexible grading to encourage individuality. How are they using the language? How are they creating with the language? That's the goal after all, especially in oral parts. So different types of assessments may have different levels of flexibility in the grading. Talking about executive functions, this is a huge issue for students. Many of our students who have EDHS or ADHD, or sorry, and elements of these challenges. So helping them break their goals into actionable steps with regular check-ins, feedback, and assignments that are designed to make them actually use the feedback, including some that are highly individualized. I often do recordings, oral recordings for students that reflects their communicative goals, speak for a certain number of minutes, choosing from the following topics. And the topics, I've just started doing this include some that students generate from AI, which we check in class. You can't let them totally loose with AI, but they can do a prompt as homework. So they get questions that actually use the verbs we want them to learn. And then choose what the context that they find interesting. Sometimes it's hard to come up with conversation topics that are engaging to students, and it's always nice to have their input. Saying that a recording will count as a quiz can enhance motivation. I think I'm going to skip this slide, but just I want to emphasize the idea that part of our, I see as my role is enhancing student agency, helping them develop their own toolkits. And here are some many things that we can do to help them develop their own toolkits. I think I'll be talking about this more tomorrow, but we can, as we teach AI skepticism, we can also teach them students how to argue with it politely as preparation for polite disagreement in study abroad and other actions. Is it really like that? Isn't it better like that? Teach them to be skeptical, but also at the same time practicing functions that are important for interactions, which is what language study is all about for many of them. I want to give it just a few in the couple of minutes remaining. I want to give just a few examples outside of this framework, but examples of things that I've experimented. I've gotten a lot of feedback from students. Students are very forthcoming when they find out that we're very interested in helping them specifically, individually. The use of color to contrast types of information. I'm not a visual person, so this isn't something that would ever occur to me, but a student did it, and I thought, wow, maybe that would help everybody to sort out these endless verbs of motion. So they're color-coded. First, they get in the homework with color-coded examples of each, and then in class, in the PowerPoints, it's reinforced. Идти is always brown. Едут ехать везде has like a green light associated with, and then the blue sky of flying. So this visual reinforcement can make it easier for students. And either I have an exceptionally good group of students this time, which is possible, or these experiments, ongoing experiments do seem to work with the visual reinforcement. Creating associations of visuals with specific points of grammar, if possible, including the same visuals on assessments that they've already seen. Here's an item-based quiz, one of the quizzes that prepares students, that helps assess, helps me assess and helps students themselves assess their mastery of the building blocks, with the visuals as cue to trigger memory and reinforce associations. Many of our students are quite visually oriented. Memorability, I've done some experience with memorability through dramatic acting. Again, I was trying to avoid an aspect in the future, written assessment and narrow assessment. So the students model texts with rising freshmen thinking about college, and they're nervous, right? So you can see this student here is saying, "Я надеюсь, что найду новых друзей." Another one really got excited about the idea of money, что буду получать хорошую стипендию все 4 года. They really get into the intonation of this and acting out in a dramatic reading of a model text. It's quite effective. It's memorable, and they remember these language forms. We also did one with a text on Rachmaninoff that they did a recording of set to the preludes of Rachmaninoff. That also helps them with phrasing too. Mm-hmm. So not all assessments have to be written, and not all assessments have to be item-based to be memorable for students. And then I think it's important, though, to include them on the next written assessment to reinforce. So one of your sentences from your aspect video as extra credit, or study barabanchik as fast as you can. Just something fun. Assessments don't always have to be dreary. Just another few things that I've learned about assessments. Chunking can be very valuable for students in assessments. This is from a test that I just gave now, actually an hour ago, and I asked students at the end, was it helpful? Yes, it was so helpful because I could really focus on the meaning and not, is it ET or is it ходить? Since it was ходить, I knew it was ездит, I knew it was Vajit and Vazit, that each was more memorable, because an assessment is an opportunity for memorability. what we assess. It's a high stakes moment, a lot of emotional involvement, and so the memorability factor is something we can tap. Here's another one. Maybe obvious, but it wasn't always obvious to me that we should repeat task types from the homework or that were done in class instead of introducing mm, mm, new text types. Sorry, my computer, there we are. So sometimes I think, oh, I've taught them all of this and now they can put it all together in new ways on the assessment. That is particularly difficult for students with neurodiversity. They need to be able to orient themselves in the type of task, have the format familiar, have the task type familiar rather than something new. So this is something that we did from this textbook right here, Russian from novice to intermediate. And then the test was very similar, but with more visual reinforcement, because I'm really finding visual reinforcement to be essential for our students, very, very helpful for our students. So each can make up their own story. They can be creative or they can not be creative. Three of these four pictures are models that they had in class with, for example, the airplane Они летят, so that they don't have an accident. Ехать and вести with the tourist bus. They've seen them before. If they need to, they can repeat something they've already done, or they have the choice of being creative. So giving students choices. Tapping oral skills and validating oral skills, like I've said, I think is absolutely critical for students. And in real life messages, imagine you're going abroad. Many of my students in third year aim to go abroad the following summer. So tapping something that they might actually want to be able to do when they're abroad. And then using the feedback to make corrections, it's motivated in this way. So in conclusion, developing classroom procedures and materials that address the needs of disabilities can benefit all students. We can address proactively characteristics that many students have, not only the logistical accommodations that we're required to provide. We can enhance long-term memorability for all students through the use of multiple modalities and consistently repeated scaffolding. Formative assessments can build students' capacity for self-regulation and agency as language learners as part of the transition to adulthood. And assessment can be affirmative. It doesn't have to be stressful. It can be validating and affirmative. And I believe that's my time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. That was fascinating. I love the idea of learning to politely argue with AI. Those are really great ideas. We're going to hold conversation for the end. So if you also had great ideas and thoughts about what Susan had to say, please hang on to those. Next up, we're going to have Lara Nelson. She's in her 11th year teaching Russian at Pritzker College Prep in Chicago, Illinois, and has been an ACTR board member since 2021. This year, Lauren has 161 Russian 1 students in her classes, so I'm sure that we all have a lot to learn from her experiences. And Lauren, I'll be sending you time info in the chat.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. And thank you, Susan, for your comment about gradually accumulated building blocks. I hope that you'll see that reflected in my presentation. I'm going to build upon that, and the pun is intended. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of audience engagement at the beginning here. So assuming that you have a fully stocked kitchen with all of the kitchen supplies that you need, what would it take for you with your current baking skills to be able to make a cake? And you can answer that in the chat. Like maybe we have some expert bakers, maybe we have people who've never made a cake. How can we get a cake out of your oven? Wait until my sister visits. I like that. Yeah, okay, awesome. Okay, so your sister must be a good baker, Susan?
Better than I am.
Oh, perfect. So you're going to get help from your sister. Lee's going to need some motivation. Alla is going to need some time. Catherine needs a recipe. Perfect. Yeah. Easy, fast recipe and total absence of distraction. I think you are already seeing where this is going, Lara. So ingredients, yep. Thank you for that. So today in supporting students with disabilities, I'd like to mention that of those 161 students, about 10% of my students have learning disabilities ranging from ADHD to autism to specific learning disabilities that can happen from like different brain injuries. And so today I'm going to give you some examples of directions, routines, and teacher exemplars that lead all of my students in my classroom to the same level of mastery. Everyone in my class is going to be making a cake. So I'm going to walk you through a lesson that ends with mastery of the objective, but is broken down into digestible steps that use appropriate supports and gradually increase complexity. So we're going to, instead of just starting with like make a cake, we're going to look at the ingredients that I give my students. So a recent objective that I was working on with my students is that they'd be able to share through writing and speaking what they love or want to eat, and also where and why. I think in like my first year teaching, I think it would have felt natural for me to be like, okay, write down what you love to eat and drink. I think that's the equivalent of telling students to just make a cake. Like some of my students could do this right away, but most of them would not be able to. Kind of, you can see in the chat too, like similarities in like baking abilities. Like some of you could make a cake without a recipe. Some of you need the instructions. So this is how I got my students to be able to talk about this objective. They first sort of brainstormed what they love to eat. And you can see my teacher example in the corner there. I love grapes. And so they saw that there and they're like, oh, well, I love avocado. I love mango. I gave them about 3 minutes to do this brainstorming session. And one of the reasons that I had them do this in English or Spanish is because if we had done it in Russian, they would have just written the same words from our limited vocabulary list. And I really wanted them to pick things that they care about, and then learn how to find the Russian translations on their own. So then the next step was that I gave them this blank plate. I drew that if you can't tell. And then I showed them my teacher exemplar, and they found out that I like apple, grapes, cheeseburger pizza, and I love Cheez-Its and drinking tea. So from there, this is a student facing slide. They were able, and these are screenshots of what they saw on their paper. They were able to see the very clear directions. They had the little blank plate in front of them, and then in the corner, they could still see my exemplar. And they went on their Chromebooks, and then they translated the ideas that they had brainstormed. And as a side note, part of the reason that I also have them do it in English or Spanish is so that they can use Google Translate and kind of figure out how to use a translator in a controlled and supported way. Like when I think years ago, I like didn't have a good sense of how to, I just kind of said, don't ever use a translator because I didn't know how to make students not abuse it. And I think I've done a much better job, and we have a very humorous discussions about different words. Like my favorite one is the mole versus mole. A lot of my students are Mexican and love mole sauce, but on their paper, I was like, wait, you love to eat the animal called a mole? And they're like, what? But then we went and did like some Google imaging or get Google image searches, and they're like, oh no, I don't eat those. The same thing happened with like, there's a very popular restaurant called Cane's, and I was like, you like to chew on like wooden sticks when they put it in Google Translate? And they're like, no. So it helped us like disambiguate those search results. And then here you can see some of my students' ideas about what they love and love to eat and drink. And you can see it really represents who they are as students. We have tamales and enchiladas, but also ramen. One student loves to eat chibarashka. She put that on there she doesn't really. And then eggs and chicken nuggets. Students had a little extra time. I was like, you can grab some markers and add some color if you want. This student apparently only eats fruit, very healthy. And then you can see some students got a little more complicated with some strawberry lemonade and chicken sandwiches, and then some drawings. From there, the next part of the objective was that they were going to share through writing. So first they figured out what they love and want to drink and eat, and now they're going to share through writing. And so what they had is they could open their packet like this, so they can both reference the food page and the little graphic organizer on the right, and they would trade papers with other students, and the students would react to their drawings and say like, oh, I also love to eat pizza, or I don't like Cheez-Its, which I don't think anyone would have said. At the top right, I have some sentence frames for writing support for students, and some of them needed it and some of them didn't, but it was there in case they needed it. And then this is the slide that students saw as we did the trading. You can see there's tons of timers in the corner, because instead of saying, oh, I'm going to give you like 20 minutes to talk to 5 people, I split it up into like, all right, you got 4 minutes with partner 4. And what this did was that these are timers that are long enough to complete the task, but short enough to like keep students on task. And then there's a little popsicle stick icon in the bottom. And in class, that for my students, that represents that I'm going to like pick their stick out of a little cup and ask them like, what did you write down? So that they're prepared. I don't surprise them. And then there's an extension activity in the bottom left where they can like draw themselves reacting to the food. Like they could be taking a bite out of a pizza. And then here's one of the students' work. So you see on the left, you see a virgin mojito. And then on the right, those are other students who looked at her food and drink and reacted to it. So you see like the different handwriting is different students. And that's an actual picture of it. And then just to give you like a clearer view, here are some PDF scans of it. Looks like a lot of people also like pasta. We're still working on accusative case a little bit, it looks like. We got the pasta on there. I'm gonna pause just so you can see that a little bit. And then from there, we were adding, they were going to share through writing what they love to eat and what they love to drink, plus where and why. So all year we've been adding on reasons why we do things. I think like early on in the year, I started asking them like pachimu about everything. And that's gotten them like really used to like explaining their reasoning and feeling comfortable saying longer sentences. And then also we've been working on prepositional case in different locations. So I gave them this graphic organizer that I think is a good example of the ingredients concept of like how to bake a cake. Like picking something from every column makes it so that even like a student who's been like absent for a while can like produce something that day, and the highest level student can still make something like that's complex and challenging to them. Under the places and the reasons why, you can see that at the bottom it says like another idea that you have, and a lot of students chose to kind of go away from the script. But the script is there if the students needed the support. And here you can see what students ended up writing about. That person nailed the accusative case up there, but we've got lemonade on the beach, and we have chilaquiles at a local restaurant. And so what I like about this is seeing what students actually like instead of just the words that we've covered in class and them talking about like cheese and pineapple all the time. Oops, sorry, clicking to the next one. So the next step after that is going to be that they're going to speak these sentences out loud. They're going to have a spoken assessment that is it's actually beyond eating and drinking. They're also going to talk about just things they love to do in general. So they can draw upon this exercise. And then we've done some other activities in class related to other verb infinitives. And then this is something that Susan had mentioned, and it was in my slides too, the multimodal assessment as scaffolding. Like students don't learn the same way and they don't demonstrate mastery the same way. So I try and assess them in different ways. Like they write it down, they draw and label, they speak. And my hope is that it helps all students succeed. And so I want to kind of think back to the very beginning when they were writing down words like grapes or mango or something really, really simple, and then show what it can grow into with the correct amount of supports. And again, like some students could have done the activity on the right, like immediately, but especially my students with disabilities who need some extra supports along the way, this allows them to participate in it too, and also make a cake. To something that our school does is maybe too much, is they're very intense about tracking student GPAs, and we can look and see each of our classes GPAs. And on this little graph here, you can see that my students with IEPs actually have a higher Russian GPA than my students without IEPs. Our school's goal is there for usually the IEP students have lower GPAs, and our goal is to have no more than a 0.3 GPA gap between general education students and students with IEPs, but mine's kind of flipped the other way. So I'm almost supporting those students more than those without disabilities. And then the chat is covering my little end here. So the end result is the same for all students, including those with learning disabilities and learning differences. And something I think about when I'm making my classroom lessons is like, am I asking students like to make a cake like right now, or am I teaching them how to make a cake? And That is, I finished before the 15 minutes, I think. Perfect. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for sharing your cake information.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think A, I want a cake, and B, that was great. And I love how a lot of what you were saying was building on what Susan was talking about around visuals as well. So I'm going to go third here to introduce myself a little bit. I am Lara Ravitch, and I teach Russian and coordinate the Russian language program at the University of Oregon. And I also am the dean or camp director of Concordia Language Village's Russian language immersion program. Whoop, that's not what I'm doing for kids in the summer. In addition to my degree in Russian teaching, I also have a background in special education. And so this topic of this intersection of language learning and disability is something that I am very passionate about. So I want to talk today about literacy supports for learners with reading challenges in Russian. Because I don't know about you, but I have certainly seen, for those of you who are in programs where students can drop something in the beginning of the year, certainly one of the first places where I see students really not sure whether Russian is for them is with the idea of the alphabet. And I've found over the last few years of trying to approach the alphabet and literacy in different ways that I've been able to overcome a lot of that initial trepidation and really keep students continuing and succeeding past those first few weeks where some of them are initially terrified about the new alphabet. I also hope that the construction that has suddenly happened in the room next to me is not distracting to all of you. So I'm going to be talking about 3 different approaches that I use to try to support students with reading challenges in Russian. Mnemonics and multisensory literacy approaches and systemic and synthetic phonics. So first of all, mnemonics. Most of you probably heard the word mnemonics and have a general idea that it has something to do with memory. It's typically about connecting things that are already solid concepts that you have with new concepts so that you can remember those new concepts easily by pulling on what you already knew. And we use mnemonics for all sorts of kinds of concepts. We use mnemonics for remembering the names of the planets or the directions north, south, east, west in our own language when we're learning different things as children. But there's a specific approach that can be helpful with mnemonics for learning a new alphabet. And what we've seen in research is that mnemonics is most effective for learning new letters when the sounds are embedded in the visuals. It's called embedded mnemonics. So for here, we've got an N that is shaped like an N sound. So, we see a lot of the pictures where there's an N and then there's some word that starts with N, right? And that's supposed to help us remember. But it turns out that what really helps people remember is when the letter is actually shaped like something that will connect us to the sound it makes. And this particular example is from a alphabet through mnemonics book that was created by Laurie Uden Nelson probably about 30, 40 years ago, my predecessor at the Language Villages. But I also have some examples in here of other so this one is one that I've created with the G actually forming the gate. You'll notice that these are not connecting to Russian words. It's also okay if you do vocabulary and letters at the same time. I know lots of folks, play Russian alphabet songs that connect to Russian words. That's great. That increases vocabulary. But if you're actually trying to use mnemonics, that idea of connecting ideas that are already solid with something new on the first day or two of Russian class, you're going to have to, of course, connect to English words because that's what they already have. That's what's solid in their brain. So this G here is a gate. We've got D for Dracula. One thing that students have always pointed out to me is some of these letters, they show up in different ways. So we have our D for Dracula, but we've also got a delta, delta, delta over there. So that students can see the alternate forms. And here's another example with some legs. Animations can also increase things. You can see the ooh here has had some oohs added to it. And we've got our yacht and our ooh. And here the mnemonics connect to both that sort of BL that our students all see in the letter ooh, right? A bully kicking you and you make the sound ooh. Here is the zzz made by our little insect friend. And of course, I think everybody uses the upside down chair for cha. And here we have a hip youth telling us, yo. This is one that I pulled from a posobia that I found online that doesn't do a ton of the integration of the letters with the visuals. But I like this one with the zh because students don't know what a zhuk is. It's fine if you teach them, but it's not going to help them mnemonically, right? And it can be a little hard to find something that works with zh, but this also uses rhyme, which can also be helpful mnemonically. So, and it does at least fit with the shape of the king's crown. You just have to then make the oral connection from king, which has no zh in it, to leisure, pleasure, measure, and treasure. And also the classic hockey sticks. Many of you may use that one already. So those are some examples of mnemonics, embedded mnemonics, which is the version of mnemonics that's been shown to be the most useful for learning new orthography. And now we've got multisensory learning. So with multisensory learning, some folks have spoken already about the importance. I think Susan talked about engaging students through different things to keep them engaged. Different students like different approaches. Even on different days, they may like things differently. So the more that we can do things from that universal design of multiple modes, multiple means, the better. But what's interesting is that some research, it's not conclusive, but some research has shown that in particular, multisensory learning of orthography is helpful rather than just sort of the traditional oral textual connection, but to have there be something where the rest of the body is engaged as well. It's not clear whether that has something to do with building new neural pathways or simply maintaining attention. But the acronym that we tend to see is visual, oral, kinesthetic, and tactile, VACT. So using VACT approaches to alphabet learning can be helpful. So what does that look like then necessarily in the classroom? Magnete. I have a bunch of sets of these magnets and I have students putting up the first syllables and then three-letter words, consonant, vowel, consonant that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then words that we have learned in class. Ideally, when I have a classroom with blackboards all over the room, we can have a whole walls of words and syllables and students reading them. And they get to touch them in that tactile way. Charadly, here's our kinesthetic version. And what this looks like in real life is something like this. Here we have the letter P and the letter M. P is in trouble over here. Luckily, that was a staff member. And many of you already use some sort of alphabet song. One of the things that I like about this one is that it has these clay versions of the letters, which is another approach that you can use for the student. So it leads us nicely into making letters with Play-Doh or clay or things like that. And all of the approaches that I've talked about so far are things that fit in well with universal design. Mnemonics are good for everyone. Using multiple modes, multiple means, great for everyone. But what do you do if you have students who really need more than you can provide to the whole class? And those are probably students who need systematic synthetic phonics. And systematic and synthetic phonics is introducing letters in order of ease and frequency, and directing students' attention to how they combine. So I think, most of us tend to start with our A, O, K, M, S, T, right? All of the letters that are similar to English. And we often tend to introduce things in terms of ease and frequency. So that part we tend to do already. What we don't necessarily do is lead students through first letter sounds, then syllables, then CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant, and then 4-letter 1-syllable words, and then introduce the 2-syllable words later. Most of us, I think, wait for introducing multisyllabic words, but building these first 4 steps. So we can't necessarily do that with the whole class. The whole class might need to move a little bit faster, but if we can have interventions with either student tutors that we can train in this or ourselves to work with students who need more intervention, then this is how we would set it up in this order. So what would we do with them? How would they go over these things? There's obviously they can use something like this that's written out and read it and repeat. That's sort of our traditional approach. But one of the things that we can really learn from special education is blending and segmenting. Blending and segmenting are taking the letters, the pieces of the words, identifying the sounds that they make, and working on how they fit together. So if we were to blend this, we would have the L and the A further apart, and then bring them closer together as students say, oh, ah. And one thing that's important is that the continuous sound works better than separated sound. So we don't want students saying l, ah. We want them saying oh, ah. And then as they get more comfortable with it, they will move to obviously less elongated sounds. Another thing that you can do, and these are classic alphabet cubes, right? You guys probably have some of these. When looking at taking out one sound from a word or one letter from a word and changing it out with another one, so that students get that repeated reinforcement. So we start with la, then we have pa. It's fun to do with the cubes. That gets that tactile engagement there as well. But sort of the classic way of dealing with blending and segmenting is with something called a blending board, where you have these different letters and you have them set up in a way that you can flip through them. It's totally fine to use nonsense words. I think sometimes as foreign language teachers, we're a little afraid to use nonsense words. Oh no, we're going to teach them some vocabulary they don't know. But for students who really need reading interventions, what they need is lots and lots of exposure to letters that make the same sounds, that are in the same combination, so that they can hear how those phonemes work together. And connect that to orthography. And so we need to not worry about nonsense words. This, of course, is an actual word, but if you end up with nonsense words, don't worry about it. The one thing that I am careful about is to avoid things that don't actually occur in a given situation. So I'm not going to have a g followed by an ly, for example, because I do want them, reading things as they occur in Russian orthography, and we're not going to have a g followed by an ly in Russian orthography. But it'll work a little bit like this, so you can see and what you would want to do if you had that in front of you. Oh, look, I have that in front of me. is to first go through one side, having them read all of them like that, and then put that down, switch out the other side, have them read that, put that down, have them read all of the vowels, and then they could do it in different combinations. But one of the things that's really important for our students who really need extensive help outside of the classroom with literacy is that repetition of the same representations for sounds in the same contexts over and over again, and then in different contexts over and over again. And that's what's key to getting our students to the point where that they can be successful, even if they have difficulty with reading. And I think one of the things that that's important is that our students don't always know they're going to have trouble with reading. They may have had trouble with reading in kindergarten and now be excellent readers. I have a student now who's an English major, fantastic reader and writer. Yeah, she got some interventions in kindergarten, but she's way past that now. And the fact that she needs help in reading and writing in Russian came as a rather upsetting surprise. And so I think that speaks a little bit to this idea that we don't necessarily know. It may be students with diagnoses or maybe not. So thank you for listening to what I have to share about reading interventions for students with particular needs for support in phonics and other areas of reading. I'd like to move on now to our next presenter. We have Alla Savelieva, who is soon graduating from the University of Colorado Boulder graduate program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. She's a passionate language educator who's taught English and Russian as second languages. Her research interests include project-based language learning, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in language teaching. Thank you, Alla.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me and making the time to listen to our presentations. My talk here stems from the desire to learn more about accessibility. I think I've achieved this goal listening to the other three presentations. I took a lot of notes, and I think my presentation will echo a lot of the techniques that have already been discussed in this panel. I have not had any training opportunities in special education, but I teach students with auditory processing disorders such as dyslexia daily, and I really wanted to learn more to help them succeed in a language classroom. So I want to talk about auditory processing disorders and how they affect language learning. I'll talk a little bit about dyslexia and also how to support learners with APD in a language classroom. So let me talk a little bit about dyslexia. It is one of the most common auditory processing disorders, and it's a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin and is characterized by the difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So these difficulties typically result from a deficit in a phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading, comprehension, and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. Different organizations, like some organizations provide numbers such as 5 to 10% of all students. Some International Dyslexia Association, for example, gives the number 15, and I think somebody in the previous presentation also mentioned that students with conditions like dyslexia sometimes make up to 10% of students in the classroom. So APD, such as dyslexia, make language learning incredibly more challenging compared to mainstream learners. And for example, for me at CU Boulder, our Russian language courses are quite fast-paced, and I can see that students with APD struggle in a fast-paced class despite their preparation efforts, right? And it has to do with phonological orthographic processing in that module in our brain. It affects syntactic processing skills. And I think what was really important for me to understand in learning more about APD is that the reason is not anxiety that a language learner gets. Anxiety is the result of putting quite a lot of effort and not getting the same results as mainstream learners. So, I think I can maybe skip these because we are all teachers of Russian, so we know like why particularly Russian is challenging. It's a different alphabet. They need to learn it in print, but also in cursive. Slight changes in writing carry a lot of meaning, right? They carry grammatical meaning. Etc. So let me focus on how to support learners with APD in a language classroom. And here I think it's important to allow learners to demonstrate what they can do rather than focus on what they cannot do. And I also find it useful to explicitly show my learners how to learn a language. I also want to mention that when processes or experiences are not designed to be accessible, then people with disabilities may have to receive accommodations in a traditional face-to-face classroom like mine at CU Boulder, so that they're able to participate or engage in the process. When I get accommodation letters from the disability office, I am not given the diagnosis because it's not their job to share that diagnosis with me. And it's typically, and I don't ask my students, but it's my students who often volunteers that information to me, right? And proactively making your classroom accessible means that you reduce or eliminate accessibility barriers when you're first creating or designing your materials, your education management platforms such as Canvas or Blackboard. So when we think of accessibility, right, we're thinking about all learners, right? So that we get fewer of those accommodation letters. And again, this really echoes UDL, Universal Design for Learning, right? If we think of all learners, including learners with APD such as dyslexia, we create a classroom that benefits all learners, right? So mainstream learners benefit from multisensory learning as well. And this is what's good about all these practices, that ultimately everybody in the classroom benefits from them. A lot of what I have echoes the previous three presentations. So it's important to build a routine and structure in the classroom. That means maybe asking students to keep folders and give very clear directions and have regular review of grammar and vocab. I took steps to make my syllabus more accessible. My university provides, the disability office provides an accessible syllabus template where you can use a screen reader. I provide a clear course outline with deadline dates. Typically, I don't really change them much. So if I have students who want to know everything from day one, they can just open the syllabus and see everything. And equally, my Canvas page is broken down into weeks with all lesson goals, all learning objectives listed, and includes all the homework and all the PowerPoints, and also cultural events and other stuff. So everything is broken down into units, and if they want to know in advance, they can go and see it. And they also understand that we have a very specific structure in this course. Next, I like to teach my students metacognitive learning strategies. So for that part of the lesson, I also use English to explain. And those strategies are aimed to raise awareness among learners, how to engage in direct, explicit thinking processes about thinking to arrive at knowledge that is available when tasks need to be completed. One of such strategies that I like to bring up with my students is linguistic worldview. So I talk about лингвистическая картина мира. So for example, when I explain prepositional with в, на, I explain this, okay, in a Russian-speaking mind, this is surface. So if it's on the surface, then use na. I also talk explicitly about test-taking strategies and a test-taking persona. This is something that I learned, I kind of knew as an English learner myself, but then also my Spanish teacher, when I was learning Spanish, brought that up, that it's important to become a different person for a test, especially when it comes to speaking, right? But also I think the written part of test taking, and here I need to have this conversation with my students that it doesn't mean that you are violating the honor code if you are saying, for example, if you're writing у меня есть собака, where in fact you have a cat, right? You need to use the vocabulary word that you remembered. You are under stress. So please, it doesn't mean that the sentences you write need to be truthful about you. This is not what we're testing here, right? But we're testing your ability to recall and to correctly write sentences, right? And use proper grammar and also think of spelling. So it's a very complex task, and therefore try to adopt a specific task-taking persona, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same as regular you. And I think a lot of students are open to this idea because it also allows them to use other expressions of their personality and imagine themselves in the Russian language to be maybe something different than they are when they speak English. Next, I want to talk a little bit about metalinguistic strategies. So having a conversation with a student about how language works, what are parts of speeches, and how do we handle their grammar, and helping them pointing out to them cognates and how to recognize common European roots in compound words, right? So all of these things, I think, when spoken explicitly, really help students who may have APD, but it also benefits all students in language learning. My colleagues here in the panel already mentioned multisensory learning. Let me give you some examples of what I do. I color code some laminate cards that I have as part of my learner training in the classroom from week 1, right? To teach them some classroom phrases so that they feel a little more confident in interacting with me in a foreign language. I teach beginner Russian. So this one, у меня вопрос, was a clip art that can also help them figure out what that means. Вы готовы? Вы согласны? I really like this one because I tend not to give my students the answer right away. I want their classmates to get a consensus, right? So that also teaches them to try to listen to each other and not just look at me as the ultimate source of information in the classroom. Right. Lara also mentioned like specific strategies to teach reading, right? Reading intervention. So with that, I found Kubiki Zaitseva really helpful. They also rattle, so they make noise. It's a lot of fun to teach prepositional, for example, and students like working with cubes, alphabet cubes, and it's also good to teach them reading with such awesome props and visuals. This is one way to also use what you see the image on the top left is to get students to use prepositions to write, but they can also like cut out and glue the images into the boxes and then write the prepositional with na. I like to use this, give this as extra homework. So this has to do with like their tactile sense. I encourage my students to learn from each other. And this has to do, for example, with this card as well, that it's not just me confirming or rejecting their answer in class, right? But everybody is listening and everybody is there to listen to their peers and confirm or correct their answer. I have another card, Pomagite, right? So this also encourages my learners to help each other out and gives them some time for rethinking. And the goal for that is to lower their affective filter. Right, I need to wrap up. I think it's also important to ask students how they prefer to learn. So for example, with seasons, my students told me themselves that, oh, how about next to each word, you also, for example, next to zima, please draw a snowflake. And next to leta, we can have sun. So this is an example of a slide that my students told me that this is the most effective ways they can learn this vocabulary. I also took time to look at how to reduce cognitive load. So I spoke to, in my university, to a specialist from Center for Teaching and Learning who looked at my tests and quizzes to make sure that I streamline exam sections and task instructions and try to reduce the cognitive load for the test and reduce the stress. And it also made me more accountable of how I design my tests, whether that's confusing or not. I also do regular tracing writing exercises. I should have probably included that, but I found a website where I can type in the vocabulary I need for the unit, and then it will produce those propisi. So I found that very useful, and I think one other way to use it is to involve chunking or grouping. For example, if you have a group of words that are all related to klimat, pagoda, then you can have them all in the same, on the same page. Positive reinforcement is also really important, right? Encouraging all students, not only students with APD, but everybody to say, no, this is good thinking, or what, and who can help you figure out the correct answer? How can we get closer to the correct answer? So all of these strategies serve to lower the affective filter. I skip talking about UDL, but UDL is great for it. Consistency, metacognitive, metalinguistic strategies, peer learning, flexibility and differentiation, and also reducing cognitive load. Lastly, the biggest takeaway for me in trying to learn more as a language educator, how can I make my teaching more accessible to all learners, is trying to meet students where they are, trying to do incremental changes to help the students that I have now in this semester, because it's nice to think like, okay, next semester I'll do this, I'll implement the next semester, but try to think of something small that you could do in the current semester. And also making learning accessible to students with auditory processing disorders is definitely an ongoing process, and therefore I'm here also to learn more. Thanks so much, and that'll be it for me.
Thank you so much, Alla. I'd like to open the floor up now for any questions or thoughts that folks would like to share. Yes, Leighton?
Thank you everyone for the presentations. I have a question for Laura Nelson. I noticed that in your student work samples, a lot of students were writing in print, like the blocky letters instead of script. So I just wanted to ask do you teach them script or do you give them a choice between print and script?
Thank you for that question. Right before this session, I think there was a conversation going on about that in like the bigger room. I show them script and give them the opportunity to like practice it, but students right now don't know how to write in cursive in English, and so sometimes it's like they have to learn like two alphabets basically. So we do it a little bit, but it's not required. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you.
Yes, Susan.
I have a question about that in terms of dyslexic students, for example. Writing, I remember when I'm not that dyslexic, but when I first started learning that she combination with just these endless lines going down, I wonder if you've come across any strategies to help students with cursive um, for whom the lines of the letters just blend together.
I don't have an answer for that. Alla, do you have anything that has helped with helping students to read cursive in particular?
It's a tough one. Sometimes we just literally put lines when I write or one of the students writes on the board. So we have this word in cursive and then literally draw lines to show them to be able to single out each letter. But beyond that, yeah, I would be interested in learning more how to help students with that.
Lee?
Just easier than finding the electronic hand.
Yes.
I think the question of teaching cursive or not teaching cursive, and if so, when to teach cursive is super interesting. And I think I've done it like all different ways. One of the things I did notice is, we have some students with dysgraphia, for example, and so they're gonna have trouble with the mechanical aspect of writing. And so we used to have an accommodation. I do teach cursive, but we had an accommodation like, they could type, they didn't have to learn the cursive. One of the issues was that they often didn't learn, they might have had other, simultaneous learning differences, but they often had more trouble learning to spell and just learning words. And what we've learned is that often when we teach handwriting, because it slows it down, and they're writing so like letter by letter and sounding it out, they actually are more successful in Russian in the long run because they're doing this. And there's a lot of research in brain science that also says taking like notes by hand rather than notes typing is much better for memory, for example. And so, and they would have difficulty because I'm writing on the board and I don't write in print. I mean, I guess I could if I were only teaching print. I would have to learn how to write. I have to think about it, even though I read in print. I don't think of the printed letters. So what I tried a couple of things that worked well, and one was having them taking the cursive thing, like the long approach to it, and having them write in cursive of words that they know, like words that we've done, words that they know. So it's not like they're doing this, kind of like, oh, how pretty can I make these things that I'm not sounding out, but actually an exercise in them writing the things of the vocabulary that they already know, and then doing it every day. And doing it on whiteboards or something like that a little bit, and so they eventually get it. So it's not like a goal like in the first 3 weeks we need to have cursive. So I found that out to be very good. And like we use Dynami, one of the things they frequently do for like the whole first semester is they simply handwrite the slides. And they're remembering the words in context of the meaning of that I want them to learn. So it's a vocabulary exercise and a full language exercise in addition to a handwriting exercise. And so I did that. And then during COVID, we were all online, right? And I don't really teach them. And we actually start more with some handwritten materials. And so it's almost like we're almost learning we learn the handwriting before we learn the block letters anyway. And then when we get to the block letters, it's more to make sure that they know the block letters and they can read, that we're doing the handwriting because they actually already know the handwriting because we've started with all materials that are handwritten. Um, and it's funny, and I realized I needed to do this because in my high school, we for the whole first year used handwritten materials, and then I graduated, and my sister stayed, and she had a horrible time in second year Russian because they jumped to the Russian from Everybody book, and it was all typed letters, and she actually never really did that understanding, and it wasn't explicitly taught, and so she ended up hating Russian then because of that like one thing. And so like knowing that I've always done it that way. And during COVID it was the opposite because we were all online reading typed letters from the very beginning. So I got us to the point of knowing all of those letters and reading fluently before I introduced cursive. So I think separating them, not doing both of them at once, but doing one first and one second was really helpful. And I want to reiterate something that Lara said, like working on the alphabet and particularly syllables. Like I've been teaching pre-college for 20 years, and what I have noticed is the students who struggle in Russian almost always can't sound out words effectively. They like we go slowly enough and there's enough oral repetition, and they've learned all of these compensatory strategies that they've used that they actually like they can master this for a while, and then you'll notice like they can't spell anything, they can't remember vocabulary, they get really frustrated. And so it's pretty quick to teach, like I've taught my tutors consonant vowel, like make them draw lines, draw syllable breaks. And so they look at the words, and with the students they'll go through and they'll draw the syllable breaks and they'll work on blending. And as soon as they do that and they practice that one-on-one, like it's like the world opens to them, and suddenly they don't. So that's like the one thing I think, like I'm so glad we had a whole presentation on working on the alphabet, because I actually really think, especially those of us who are pre-college and who can slow down, I think making sure that they're confident in reading syllable by syllable is maybe the most important thing we could do, and then you could always speed up later if we want to hold on to all of our students.
Yeah, there's just so much information they get by text, and if they can't process it efficiently, then that information is entirely inaccessible to them, and puts them at a huge disadvantage. Katya, I think you had your hand up a while ago.
I just want to say thank you for the idea of the blending board, because for some reason I had never ever thought about that. And I was like, wow, that's genius and so flexible. And you could extend it, right? You could get another syllable on a blending board if you wanted to. You might have to finagle a little bit, but yeah, I'm going to start using that because again, so we're more than halfway through the year. And with my first year students, now there's been a big divide, like who can read and sound it out and who totally cannot yet. So working on the ways to get those other ones up to speed some more.
And there's
Thank
a
you.
lot of other forms of blending boards. If you just Google blending board, you'll get some that look like Scrabble letter holders and, with sets of wooden letters and stuff that are much fancier. Mine is just the poor man's blending board, but you can get much cooler ones. Yeah. One other thing I just wanted to mention about dyslexia and auditory processing disorder, that I think from a special ed perspective, we think of dyslexia typically as a phonological processing disorder, which certainly has an auditory element. But then there's also a separate disorder that has the name auditory processing disorder. I think all of the strategies that we saw basically apply to both, and the symptoms are really overlapping, and the strategies that we use for them are really overlapping. But one thing that is interesting to me is students with dyslexia typically don't have the same trouble like following oral instructions unless they also have some sort of additional disability. And so I was wondering, Alla, if we tease apart dyslexia and the disorder that is called auditory processing disorder, rather than looking at them all as but both under the umbrella of things that are related to hearing. Do you have thoughts on things that are that would be particularly helpful for students who have difficulty with that following, oral language, even in their own language, when they're in that foreign language classroom?
I wonder if micro teaching would really help, just making sure that some students do better when you actually read the instructions to them, right? Rather than just quietly giving everybody the test or the quiz. So I found it useful to regularly monitor my classroom and see if anybody is lost, or just to remind them to be on task and maybe read the task for them.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that I've read about dyslexia, you could teach strategies for them to learn to encode and decode. Auditory processing is such that their brain processes more slowly. So we actually can't really teach strategies. We have to use accommodations. So one of the things that I've done is because, for example, you have a listening scenario and they're supposed to listen to it, and then they're supposed to answer some questions. The student it's a processing delay. So they're hearing things later, and while they're processing that, the text has moved forward and they weren't listening anymore. So like they truly can't do it at that speed. So chunking is a really effective strategy. And I think you're absolutely right that with directions for them, having them written, like I think always using multimodal and having it spoken and having it written. Because for auditory processing, they actually need it written so they can go back to it. And when I do, for example, listening comprehensions, I might, if there's like 5 questions in a long dialogue, I might say, I'm going to play the part that's the first question. And then I stop it. And then I play the part that's the second question. And I stop it, because then they have much littler to listen to. And it's much more fair. Like they're understanding the Russian, they're just not understanding it at the speed that it's coming in. And it's not even the pace of the words as much as it's the scope. But I'm so sorry. This is such an interesting conversation. I love talking about teaching. And I need to go to the other room to make sure that we have some sort of plan for this 8 o'clock thing. So I'll see you all later.
Thankfully.
I have a comment for Lauren. I find it super interesting that your school is trying to close the gap between IEP students and the more general education students, and that they're keeping the statistics on that. Have you thought about why it might be that the IEP kids are thriving so much in your Russian classes, other than the accommodations you're giving them? But why are they doing better than the other ones?
I do think about this a lot because it didn't used to be the case. And I think what it is I have now kind of leveled the playing field for all students, and people with lower grades in my class. It's usually behavioral issues, like maybe they're putting their head down all the time, or they're like in the bathroom for half an hour. And that's not like a disability related issue. It's like a behavior related issue. So that's what that's my theory.
So grades in your school are all lumped together? Because in our school, we're not allowed to give them an academic grade that is based on their behavior like that. Like,
Oh, I don't give them a grade based on that. I'm just saying, like, the students who are like out in the bathroom for half an hour are missing out on instruction. So they're doing more, like they're doing poorly. Yeah. Yeah. I don't grade behavior. No.
Well, thank you all very much. We're now at 5:01. So I really appreciated all the different things. There were so many commonalities among everything that people shared, and also so much of value in each individual presentation. So thank you very much to my fellow presenters, and to everyone who added fantastic things in the discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Alla, for joining us. yesterday. Really
Yes.
wonderful.
Yeah, so well, thanks so much for having me. It's been fascinating.